Hello, everyone. We're just waiting a couple of minutes so everyone can tune in, and then we're going to start. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the FIPRA Network, Alpine Group, Earnscliffe Strategies, and Instrac, thank you so much for tuning in this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are currently. We'll be starting shortly, and please feel free to post any questions on the Q&A function, and don't forget to follow our LinkedIns to hear about the future webinars. You can take it, Rod.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks everybody from wherever you are in whatever time zone. And I have to start with that because Colin is literally on the exact opposite side of the planet. So somewhere between Japan and here. Oh, do we have feedback? All right, sorry about that. But I appreciate everyone making some time for what I think will be a very timely conversation. When we had first originally talked about doing this kind of roundtable discussion on in essence, the USMCA markets, talking about trade and tariff policy, we thought this might be a timely week. We did not really quite realize how completely timely this conversation might be for all of our clients, for our friends in the policy arena. But what you have here today are experts from Ottawa, Mexico City, and Washington, D.C., who have spent a long time in the trade tariff world advising clients and been a part of, in many cases, government advocacy, and if not participating in the government. And it comes together under this umbrella, as you see, as it opened under the FIPRA Network, where our firms have been working, and particularly these three firms have been working so closely together for a very long time, where issues like particularly trade and tariff are not only complex for the single market that we each operate in, understanding and having sophistication of what is happening in the other market, what their government is thinking, what the stimulants are in their market, and how that impacts what their governments have to advocate, is something we all have to navigate. And so this conversation is helpful to ourselves, but we thought, in essence, letting people eavesdrop in would be helpful and useful for others to gain some insight and knowledge. So what we will do today to try to make this as fast moving and valuable as possible is I'm going to let each of our colleagues here introduce themselves quickly and to the relevance to this conversation. Then we've got a few questions that I think will generically hit a number of the topics I think hopefully you as the audience will find interesting. But if you have questions, do enter them into the chat room. We will try to get the things to make sure we are covering as the best we can what's top of mind for you. And then look forward to any kind of follow-up. If people have questions after this, you kind of will know how and where to be able to find us. But I'm going to start for the introductions with the person who's up the latest and the furthest away from the table, and that's Colin. So do you want to introduce yourself first? Whoop, you're on mute. Colin, you're on mute. There we go.
Better now?
There, it's better.
Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Colin Brainerd. I'm a vice president at the Alpine Group. I have been covering trade issues for quite some time. My background, I worked for Republican members of the House Ways and Means Committee who were very active on trade issues, was with them when they were in office during the Trump 1 tariffs. So I have experience there as well. Afterward, went to work at Walmart before I joined the Alpine Group. So obviously another company heavily impacted by trade and tariff policy.
Juan, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the call. I'm Juan Pardinas from Mexico. I was CEO of a public policy think tank called the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness. And then I was managing editor of the newspaper Reforma. During my time as in IMCO, we played a role helping the Mexican government deciding the retaliation policy with the Teamsters conflict a few decades ago. And now I'm the policy trade advisor for Instruct.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marianne Carter. I work at Earnscliffe Strategies based out of Ottawa, Canada. My background, I have a background in law. Before joining Earnscliffe, I worked at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, predominantly focused on trade issues ranging from procurement to reviewing a variety of trade tribunal discussions with a variety of countries across both Canada and the US. Since joining Earnscliffe, I've worked with a variety of Fortune 500 companies, ranging also to non-for-profits, both operating Canada, US, some in Mexico, and also internationally. And I think it's important to point out as well, we work with a number of companies, American-based companies operating in Canada, as well as Canadian companies operated in the United States. So this will be the unique perspective I bring today.
Terrific. And then I'm Rod Shaw. I'm the chairman of the Alpine Group, helped found it nearly 29 years ago. And the privilege that affords me is allows me to ask the first question. So where I would start is the dynamic around trade and tariff is driven very much by what's happened on the ground in the economy, what people are thinking about, what people are concerned about. And so the first question I'd love each of you to give the audience some take on, particularly for those outside the market they operate in. What's been driving either and Colin, I'm going to come to you first since the U.S. has kind of set so much of this in motion. You know, what is it that is propelling this dynamic, this trade tariff posture that we're seeing? But also then would love for each of you to go through and talk about kind of what your market sees or how they're responding or reacting to that. Because again, while that's not so much gossip, that is actually level setting the politics that we can all kind of use to formulate strategies, thoughts to react if we kind of know what the stimulant is. So Colin, you willing to go first on that question?
Yes, sir. Thanks, Rod. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think what we see here when we're looking from a U.S. perspective is Trump continuing to reject the old economic consensus that free trade is the best way to do things. We see this particularly as we look at our Canadian and Mexican partners here today. We have what has been a pretty great system for all three countries since NAFTA and under USMCA. What we see now is really Trump under the belief that the only way to really ensure economic success here is to bring all of these jobs home to America. He feels that trade imbalances are really a national security threat in a lot of ways, no matter who the partner is, whether it's, you know, he does not discriminate, I don't think at this point again, between a China or a Mexico or a Canada, and he sees a real need to bring these jobs home.
I'm going to take a little Mexican perspective on that.
Yeah, as a recovering journalist, I was looking to the New York Times on Saturday, and I found a huge editorial mistake on a story about trades and tariff. It was the main story of the newspaper. In the first paragraph, they stated that the exchange between Mexico and the US was nearly $1 billion a day. Then you read the same piece a few paragraphs later, and the newspaper stated that it was 800 billion a year. If it's nearly $1 billion a day, you will never find a year you could reach 800 billion. Actually, the correct figure, it's 800 billion a year. If you turn it down to a day, it's or an hour, it's like $95 million every hour of exchanges, goods and services between Mexico and the US. So try to derail that train and you will hurt a lot of people in both sides of the border. This belief, as Colin was saying, of President Trump is not sustained by evidence. So it's a complicated political struggle between hard evidence and an ideology and a belief. That on the good side of the evidence is all that amount of pain that would come out of derailing this train. Well, there are voices, there are political structures, there are muscles in both sides of the country and also with Canada that will also play in the conversation. And in a way, it won't be so easy to implement this narrative we are seeing now from the White House.
If I can follow up on that, even in the starting point, you've also just come off of an election and you now have a new leader who is being confronted with this early into the tenure. Is there anything the audience should be thinking about, either the political dynamic or pressure she faces with, I'm new to the job and I've been suddenly handed this challenge? Is that going to affect, does she need to fight hard? Is she in a position where people say just acquiesce to get deals done? Any insights as to what the new government means?
Without a doubt, this means that the hardest test that President Sheinbaum has had on her term. She just has been on the position for 3 months, 4 months. And this would be maybe the biggest challenge of her 6-year administration. So far, she has been successful. Maybe we had this conversation 48 hours before. The state of affairs would be quite different. But I think for her, it's a huge opportunity to get the country together, to get even the opposition, like we have to face this conflict as a nation together. And in that regard, I think it could be a political opportunity for her. We should, on the positive side, from the Mexican perspective, she controls both houses of Congress. She has a strong control of the executive. So that guarantees certain degree of stability. And on the internal front, it would be much more easier to confront the further negotiations that we would have to face.
So the opposite of stability is maybe what's happening in your market. Randy, you want to tackle a couple of those elements?
I wouldn't say it's the exact opposite that's happening in Canada, but as many of you will know, our Prime Minister resigned earlier in January. And while he is acting Prime Minister, we're in the middle of a Liberal leadership race. And I can get into some of the dynamics around that a bit later. But even when the 30 days are up, the Liberal leader will be chosen on March 9th, which is after the 30-day period. But despite the political dynamics happening in Canada and uncertainty around our new leader, I would say there is a renewed patriotism that is separate from the partisanship and the divisions we'd seen prior to President Trump's announcement a week ago. The country is quite unified on this, and that's also from a multi-jurisdictional level as well. Canada's premiers have come out pretty hard as well. And I personally, and I think many of my fellow Canadians will say, we've never really seen something like this before. There is a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, and I don't see that being reflected in the American news cycle at all. I think Canadians feel or they understand the intricacies of our economic relationship with the United States, which is vaguely understood in certain areas of the US. But I think it goes broader than that, to the fabric of we're friends and allies. We fought in wars together. Like, there's a real pleasantry between our two countries. And that sentiment right now has been turned on its back head. Like, it is, people are mad. And I just want to underscore that, because I have never really seen or witnessed that sort of dynamic, even when NAFTA was being reviewed a few years ago, and we know how Colin will know the challenges around some of those dynamics. But this is quite unprecedented, and I think when it comes to the pause, it's a bit of a taking a beat of there's uncertainty. We can breathe and get our regroup for a few weeks, but this isn't over. And I think there's going to be a lot of questions over the upcoming days on what's next and how do we navigate this with so much uncertainty and so much volatility.
It's great insight. So there's a lot of different places we can kind of go, but maybe where I would start is I think from the US standpoint, so much of what has happened in the trade world came out of what happened out of COVID, where the supply chain and the interdependency became a problem, not an economic salvation. And in that, China very quickly became a focal point of US policy. We couldn't get, PPE and pick the other, goods and service or goods writ large. And so I'm curious, because so much of this trade debate has been projected onto China, and then your two markets in particular then either get accused of, are a part of whatever audience you use, of facilitating China product entering the US and so on. And you also have your own market with China. You have your own, shoreline at the Pacific facing west. Do you guys mind talking a little bit about what you think the balancing act? You have the United States in that economy, you have China playing it. You're a bit of a ping pong ball in that dynamic. How are your governments at this point thinking about how you balance out that relationship? Are they thinking about balancing it? Are they taking it one at a time? Do you mind just talking a little bit about the China dynamic?
Yeah, going back just to a point now, what Canada is experiencing now regarding the Trump's attitude towards the country is what we experienced in 2016 and 2017. So
welcome.
yeah,
The water's fine. Hop in.
I don't want to brag about it, but we have been there. And actually, if we could learn something from that experience, there was a lot of noise, but at the end of the policy messages kind of sustain and even increase the trade relation between the two countries. Hopefully, Trump 45 would be a reference to Trump 47. That I don't know. It's just a hypothesis. Regarding the with of China, I think it's the main card that Mexico could use in the negotiation with the US to really strengthen our commercial bloc between the three countries, protecting ourselves from Chinese unfair trade, like selling cars, for example, in the Mexican market with prices that are really hard to believe and even harder to compete for US firms in the US markets. So there's a lot to do from the Mexican perspective that we could do policy-wise to protect from using rational economic arguments to protect Mexican industry against dumping of Chinese, different kind of Chinese products. And one thing I would like to say to the trade negotiators from the US side is you could verify, and we could increase the ways the US government could verify that Mexican products are actually produced in Mexico. I wonder it would be much more easier for the US government to verify that these products are not Chinese fake products introduced as made in Mexico, that if you try to do the same in Vietnam, for example, that if you see the rate of increase of exports to the US after the tariffs were imposed by Trump 45, Vietnam was one of the big winners with Chinese investment. So if you really want to verify that the products made in Mexico are actually made in North America, that's a good opportunity and something the Mexican government could put on the table in the negotiating table. It will be much more harder to do it 18 or 12 time zones away in Vietnam.
It's great insight. You have thoughts from your market as well?
I bring a somewhat different perspective. I think there's got to be, there's a number of synergies between Canada and the US on China when it comes to national security. For those that don't know, Canada's relationship with China in recent years hasn't been so hot. Going back from the arrest of Meng Wanzhou over the Huawei issue to having two of our most senior diplomats detained for nearly 2 years. China, it really some improvements, but one of the major focuses in terms of interests that is alignment, not just with the United States, but other countries within the EU and elsewhere, is securing the critical mineral market. We've seen a lot of interest from the Chinese marketplace investing in Canada and in the natural resources sector. And that's one area, despite the tariff dynamics, I think there's a real opportunity for alignment as it pertains to the supply chains around autos and, chips and that sort of thing. And we need to be much more thoughtful about collaboration and how we are working in that space. And it's all in the name of national security and securing markets, which I think President Trump is quite aligned with. So that's where I would say there's like low-hanging fruit when it's comes to the Chinese relationship, but it's also about diversifying our focus. We've already had a lot of conversations with EU partners and other parts of the world in this space. So when it comes to China, I think it's really is about framing it around national security.
And Colin, I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of where you were before, but that gave you a front row seat to the most sophisticated, globalized trade company. With that background and with what you're seeing today, how would you answer or provide people insight into the U.S.-China dance and the role that, the thing we hear in the hallways all the time is, well, they'll just come in through Mexico, or they'll come in through Canada, or we're just trying to wean ourselves off. And yet at the same time, they only got a 10% tariff threat and our friends got the 25%. What would you share on that?
Yeah, just completely agree with what Juan and Marianne were saying. Just a continued missed opportunity by Trump to really build a global consensus around China, which is, I think, in my opinion, what he should be doing. I think what we could be more effective is uniting the North American countries with the EU and others to really exert pressure and influence on China. I think those national security concerns, I think, are valid. I think what Canada is worried about is what the US is worried about as well. What worries me and what should worry us is that reactions to the Trump tariffs the first time from China did result in nearshoring, friendshoring, these kinds of things. And now it looks like this is a target for Trump. This is going to be a very difficult thing to bring about in terms of landing the plane on this, because supply chains have shifted. We know that supply chains don't shift overnight. They don't shift by March 4th either, from February 4th. It's going to be I think it creates a very difficult dynamic though right now.
So one of the other dynamics that's interesting is most everyone, I'm assuming on this call, if you looked at kind of who is our RSVP'd, was business related. And yet, actually, if you look at the justification for a lot of this, it is actually tied to immigration or drug control, fentanyl, et cetera. And so I'd also be curious, each of your take on, is your country, and for all three of them, think that actually this is an economic issue that will actually be played out eventually as an economic issue, and how you react to immigration controls, how you deal with the fentanyl issue, whatever, is that going to be part of the bargaining chip? You go, nope, we really are taking the president on his word. It is focused on this versus economics, because that's a interesting interplay for many of the businesses impacted by this. Is I'm looking at it solely economically, and yet it may be that Mexico and the U.S. trade tariffs shift simply by what Mexico agrees to do on slowing immigration, controlling immigration, drug interdiction, dealing with cartels. There's kind of non-economic, not that those don't have ripple effect, but non-economic impacts. You willing to maybe tackle that first one in terms of how you think Mexico is looking at those two different narratives that it's being asked to navigate?
Yeah, I will have to use this Chinese cliche that every crisis is an opportunity. And from the security perspective of Mexico, this crisis is a huge opportunity. I think we have been negligent of the fentanyl thing. The former president, López Obrador, didn't want even to acknowledge that Mexico produced, or there was kind of a breach for fentanyl to reach the US. So I think this is an opportunity to take a regional perspective, as Marion was saying, on national security. For us, our biggest national security threat, it's not China, it's the drug cartels. So if we could have the US more involved and consider that both countries need each other to guarantee its national security, I think there is a huge narrative there to reach the differences. And if this is the big challenge of your question, Rob, is that we have the security perspective from the fentanyl, you have migration, and you have the economic reasons behind the tariffs. Which is the real one, we still don't know. For me, my biggest concern is that the White House sees the tariffs as a way to solve the fiscal imbalance in the US. Then if that's the path, then we're in big trouble. If it's security, it's a huge opportunity. Migration, Mexico could help a lot the Trump administration to reduce migration from Central America, even from Mexico. From security, I would see it even with positive eyes, how the security of the Mexican people could improve through increased cooperation from both countries. My big concern would be if it's an economic argument to solve the budget imbalance in the US.
Same kind of question to you.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. So the bigger picture is Trump leading this renaissance to the golden age, right? And restoring the industrial base and using fentanyl and immigration as a way to wield his favorite economic weapon, which is tariffs. And with the most utmost respect to our Mexican friends, like these issues are just not the same in Canada. There was one, like in terms of the illegal immigration, President Trump references, it was approximately 1.5% of apprehensions in the United States. And in terms of fentanyl, less than 1%. And there's a number of national security experts and economists who have referenced these stats. And so I think from a Canadian perspective, we struggle to grasp this emergency that somehow the president is painting that is just dissimilar from what's happening in Mexico. It's not to dismiss that there isn't issues, but it's just not at the same level in Canada. But a thing that also came out of yesterday was that Trump was able to establish that we committed 10,000 troops at the border, which goes back to his focus on using tariff threats to secure national security. One thing I want to make clear, though, is that this $1.3 billion package that he claims he got at a Trudeau yesterday was in fact introduced in December through our fall economic statement process as actually lending a hand to the United States to demonstrate we're serious about this in advance of his inauguration. So that kind of got misconstrued in the media yesterday and this morning, but it's a tactic that's working, right? And he's using these sort of these political fear operatives to, utilize the economic argument to help build his income tax narrative domestically and these sorts of things. And it's going to come at the cost of creating this national emergency around the Canadian border, which just isn't as extreme as he's making it out to be.
Colin, we've got folks from literally around the world. There's any number. We've got scores of different countries listening to this. So I'm going to make you the statesman for the U.S. government. But do you want to offer whatever insight you think you can as to those three dynamics of national security, let's use that as fentanyl, immigration, and economics? What do you think is motivating it so that the audience can kind of get a sense of how they start to score at home and what their strategy should be of, how do we navigate which priority for the administration at this point?
No, it's a great question, Rod. Yeah, I think it is mostly economic. Trump, kind of like Marianne said, Trump does see tariffs. He frequently touts them as a way to basically expand the revenue base in America. folks on Capitol Hill could be looking at tariffs as a possible pay for a tax package. But I think that if we look at it in terms of the timeline, right now, this might be fentanyl and immigration, these cultural flashpoints here. But that's through March 4th, and really through March 31st. But on April 1st, when these reports are due from his initial executive order here, I think what we're going to see is really a shift towards that purely economic, away from the cultural flashpoints, possibly, and then pivoting towards the economic side. So, and what we see here is classic Trump, right? He is staking a maximalist negotiating position as the deal maker extraordinaire, kind of using a crisis or kind of manufacturing a crisis to then create an economic crisis, essentially, is what we're going to have here, to win concessions from Canada and Mexico, and then to hopefully declare victory, and I think that we'll see this now. I think what we're going to see April 1st is going to have more to do with USMCA renegotiation that's due next summer. And so I don't see this ending anytime soon. And I think that he could easily pivot back to, he could be going on off trade deficits for a while and then pivot back to immigration and fentanyl. I think that all three will continue to play a role.
So Colin, sticking with you for a second, one of the things that comes up often in conversations, both in Washington and with friends from around the world, is this is such a monumental shift in direction for the Republican Party, that this has been a party of free trade for so long. Tariffs have not been something that has been in vogue. And so one of the questions people ask, and again, just welcome any insight you think you can offer, is will a Republican House and Senate support all of this if and when the time comes? You talked about the fact this could be a revenue dynamic. I think Juan also raised it as, is this something where how we start to pay down the debt, or how we pay for the tax cuts, or whatever? Is there any insight you would share with, does he have carte blanche to kind of do what he wants? He has the executive authority to do it. That's pretty well vested into the executive branch. But is there pushback, division, concerns people should be thinking about that you're hearing from the rest of the Republican Party that's in town?
Yeah, no, Rod, it's a great point. The party has definitely shifted a lot. I think maybe some lessons from 2017, 2018, when we saw especially the renegotiation of USMCA and really the 301 tariffs on China, probably more specifically. What you saw from Republicans on Capitol Hill at that point was they did not seek to repudiate Trump. And I think that was testament then to the power of Trump. What they sought instead, really, like the victories that Republicans on Capitol Hill would seek, were through exemption processes on 301 tariffs or something like that. Or yes, if you want to renegotiate NAFTA, let's do it, and let's do it in good faith. I think what you see now with Trump too is a Trump who is at the absolute peak of his political power here. His hold over the Republican Party is immense. And it is funny when you see, if you would redact names on press releases and go back 15 years and ask, is this a Republican condemning tariffs or a Democrat condemning tariffs? It's a complete flip. You see Ron Wyden, ranking member of Senate Finance Committee, completely condemning this. You see, and then on the other hand, your next email in your inbox will be Chairman Jason Smith, a Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, saying these tariffs are great and this is going to make America a better place. And so I think you will see pushback on the Hill. And I think that what Capitol Hill Republicans will want to see in any tariff process is an exemption process, so that they can go back to their constituents and say, hey, I'm fighting for you. I'm a Kentuckian. I'm fighting for, our bourbon interests at home, or something like that. So I think we're going to see very limited pushback. And this isn't even pushback necessarily. This is it's a very light form of pushback, I would say. Yeah.
I'm going to start shifting over some of the questions we're getting asked, and this is broader, and I don't even know if any one of you can answer it, but I'll put it out there and let the conversation happen. Which is, so we have got tariffs in this discussion about Canada, Mexico, and China. We're apparently buying Greenland. We are looking at what we're going to do with Panama. We have just weighed in with a real condemnation of what's happening in South Africa. We have suddenly kind of globalized a lot of things in a way that the U.S. may have done more subtly, maybe the phrase. I don't know what in the past, but are you guys also thinking in your markets, this is also making you rethink who are you guys suddenly looking east more, saying, well, you know what, it looks like we can probably negotiate better deals with the EU and the US should be thinking about that? Are you thinking, well, you know what, we're going to now have our own kind of relationship with China because this seems hard to tell, or we're looking at a relationship with India or whatnot? I mean, we've kind of put most of the 7 continents, but for Antarctica, into play in some form or another. So one of the questions was, any sense of how the US or your countries might be dealing with that? I don't know if anybody wants to take that, because that's a really broad, interesting question.
I just saw an editorial cartoon, which I think was very eloquent, that said, we had the G20, then we also have the G7, and Trump is starting the G1, which is Trump by himself. And what happens with the G1 in a Cold War with China? If you see, for example, the trade in Colombia from the beginning of the century, China was just like 5% of their total exports. Now it's around 30, something like that, almost as big as the US. It's one of the few countries in South America, Colombia, that still the US is its main trading partner. Most of the countries' main trading partner is China. So what happens when your former friend and your former ally suddenly becomes a new threat? That was not what happened in the Cold War of the 20th century. In the Cold War of the past century, you have 2 very clear sides. Now you have 3 sides. You have the people that feel fine to be in the crowd with Putin and Xi Jinping. You have the crowd of people that countries that used to be allies of the US, but now you have these allies of the US that feel betrayed, and we have been friends for so long, we have been close for so long, why are you behaving so badly? So this geopolitical change could have huge consequences. How is gonna the G1 operate in a world with so much conflict and risk?
Yeah. So Canada has always thought about identifying unique trading partners. Obviously, the U.S. has been, and looking at NAFTA and looking at the North American bloc, that's been something around for over 30 years. But we're used to having, relationships and thinking globally and internationally and partnerships. And that's something that's been more front and center recently. Canada would have never talked to Taiwan, and now we're actively talking to Taiwan and Japan. But also, I've referenced the EU a few times, but I think if this week has pointed out anything, or I guess I should say the last 48 hours rather, there's going to be a lot of self-reflection, not just within the political realm, but in Canadian industry on how to mitigate risk and seizing new opportunities, because we all know business like certainty, and Trump just started his tenure. And so if this is going to continue on, and Colin had referenced the review of USMCA coming in 26, this is changing the goalposts, or as I view it, at least the precursor to starting an early negotiation around that. And so I think some of our key industries that we're exporting to in the US, there's going to be a lot of rethink. It's also an opportunity for Canada to reflect on its unique relationship with Mexico. And you had referenced autos and some of there may be a renewed sort of focus on bilats between our 2 countries if this tariff dynamic or wave or mountain we're climbing is going to continue for several months. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversations happening with other allies in different parts of the world on how we can work better together.
So you both touched on something I'd like to go a little deeper on, which is sectors that are important, right? We are all interconnected on energy. We have autos that flow across. Some are really big on timber, et cetera. We also have somebody sitting at the table here down who represents in the beverage alcohol universe, where actually items have been the ping pong ball in steel and aluminum fights, et cetera. There's kind of the collateral damage industries and sectors too. Are there sectors or industries you go from each of your markets? You say, we know where I think you as America, you as businesses should be thinking really strongly about, and the one I'm going to start with to maybe lead it off is energy, right? We hear people saying, well, the Canadians going to cut off the oil, and are they going to send it to, China or into the Asian basin? And that's a place where they feel they have a real strong tool. We are tied to Quebec hydro in the Northeast. Is that a tool? You can pick any given sector, but are there ones where you go, I don't think the Americans really understand how strongly we're going to fight to protect or use this as a weapon back? Any sectors?
Well, obviously energy, but just a quick joke. A number of Canadians are saying we got to cut the power during Super Bowl Sunday, and then they'll really understand.
No power, no avocados.
No, but I think there's a number of sectors, and they're pretty, we've said energy, agriculture is a huge, and it's not just like the traditional, it's like it's in these very focused regions in certain states on like agriculture, technology, all these sorts of issues. But on the energy piece, I just want to pick up on something where, we export over 50% of crude oil, and Trump is saying, well, we can do this. We have all the energy, but that's not without trade-offs, right? Like, you haven't built a refinery since 1977. So you can't just like snap your fingers and you're going to start to be able to refine all this crude oil. Americans are going to have to pay for it at the pump, or, it's not just impacting business. It's going to be the cost of how it's impacting the household. And I think that's what is missing from this narrative is like, yeah, you can go back to creating some or build these massive, manufacturing firms and these sorts of things, but that takes time. And who's going to pay for it? And at the end of the day, we all know it ends up coming out of the back pockets of the consumer. But I think, obviously, there's the key ones we've obviously seen throughout NAFTA. But one of the things it's not, at least from what I've read, hasn't been touched on a lot is digital trade. That's obviously something that's a huge actor, and taxation isn't quite always figured out, but with like streaming services, et cetera. But I think that is something that is going to be consequential, but not well understood in terms of how our countries are doing business together, and how like not just goods and services are moved across the border, but these like actual like digitized products that aren't like viewed in the typical way of, getting on a truck and going back and forth. So
I got an interesting question here because it touches on something that shows up across clients, and that it's kind of the natural resource, critical minerals dynamic we all face if we're trying to build things here. And one of the questions I think is really insightful, which is basically getting at, it's wonderful to say you want to do that, but then you might need mining reform to be able to actually access, build, and get at any of that.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions was, do you, as we look at that, whether it's for the US or each of your markets, one of the questions was, is the new president of Mexico changing, morphing positions on mining, energy policy, et cetera, that will have impact to the US? And the same thing would be true for Canada, because the US is asking this too. We are looking at permitting reform. We are looking at trying to change the incentives for actual mineral extraction so we can actually build some of the things where we need the raw product. But any sense of what that either opportunity or change in dynamic may look like in your two markets?
In the case of President Sheinbaum, she has kind of a narrative challenge because she cannot break or affect the legacy of President López Obrador, which is her political mentor and kind of still like a huge political leader, despite the fact she has not been in front of a camera for almost 120 days. She cannot break with him. But in the facts regarding security and regarding energy, she is doing things that kind of break apart what López Obrador was saying. And regarding energy, she understands very clearly the need of private investment in order to Mexico fulfill its energy needs regarding especially utilities. So if you see the messages of Claudia Sheinbaum, you don't see a policy change. If you see the facts, some things really are happening regarding security and energy. Whereas waiting, maybe it will come up this week, the specifics on the new energy changes to be much more flexible and open to private investment in renewables and electricity.
Since you touched on that, this is why I like a free flow. I'm going to come to you with the same question. One of the things that occupies a lot of the U.S. mind is the challenges of investment in Mexico, particularly when it comes to energy, because of the threat of nationalization or how that works. Do you have any sense of whether that dynamic is now different under this administration, or now with these kind of trade dynamics and the importance of energy and cross-border? Is international investment going to be more confident, you think, in they're not going to see the government change policy and suddenly eviscerate investment?
I see much more pragmatism and less ideological drive in the moves that the government is taking. That's maybe the biggest difference between Sheinbaum and López Obrador, but she cannot talk about it. If you see the speeches, she still talks about national sovereignty, but national sovereignty and we're open, being more flexible to private investment. Well, they usually don't come together in the same speech, but she's managing to do this act to have like a difference between the facts and the narrative. She has to protect the legacy of López Obrador, but she's doing things differently, which give us some hope. Also, the same thing regarding security. It's a very different policy than López Obrador. She has put in jail some, for example, municipal presidents that were protecting organized crime in different parts of the country. That never happened with López Obrador. So she's not walking the talk. She's walking one way and saying another thing, but that might be positive if you see the political place where she's sitting.
Interesting. Right. So resource-rich Canada, what does that mean for you guys?
I'm glad you asked this because I do a lot of work in this space. We all know that these projects, government can take forever to approve them, but interestingly, in Canada, we think our permitting process is slow, but the US is often looking to Canada as a model for permitting reform, which is, I find really interesting. But, one of the things, like, we're a small country, but we're abundant in natural resources and talent. And insofar as our natural resources are sought after and invested in by American firms. And I think that's really important because I see a lot of funding coming into rare mineral, rare earth projects in Canada's north, throughout Quebec, even in the East Coast. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. And that goes back to some of the focus around national security. But there has been a focus, Rod, in the last few years, not just by the federal government, but also provincial governments on these critical mineral strategies and expediting projects. So regardless if it's private funding or working more efficiently, there's been a real focus on working with First Nations communities, partnerships, and making these projects work more quickly in the depth of winter, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's not going to happen quickly, but again, this goes back to my earlier point about mitigating risk, rethinking the volatility and the reliance. How are we setting ourselves apart? And that is one thing that Canada thrives in, is in natural resources. But you need to get the projects up and moving faster, and government creates a lot of bureaucracy around that. And we are seeing shifts in different areas. It's still a challenge, but I think we are ahead of that. At least my friends in Colorado tell me we're ahead of that in the US. But this is where I think there may be a renewed focus on some of the provinces who don't necessarily get along historically well, on how can they work together on collaborative projects to help be competitive in the global marketplace with some of these minerals.
Colin, coming to you with a question we were sent, which is, I think, I want to expand on the question that was provided, which is, I think there are a lot of observers looking at this going, is this administration fully committed to this whole trade tariff dynamic, and this is a 4-year play? Or is this something that this is where we're at for this quarter? And then we chase another rabbit, in another quarter, and we chase something else a little bit later. And so because it's unclear kind of like how you play out all the various games here, their question basically is one of, I think, surprise as I read the tone of it, which is, why has U.S. business been muted in its reaction to these tariffs when there's a lot of consternation if you talk privately with them? And so do you want to talk a little bit about how you think American businesses are positioning themselves with this administration and this Congress at this moment? It's a good international question as to how and why are you yourselves behaving?
Yeah, sure, Rod. Yeah, I think that, the response has been muted. It's been interesting to see how few CEOs have been out there really on the issue, talking about how damaging, especially these tariffs could be right here. But that being said, we have seen a lot of work going on behind the scenes. I know we've been working with our clients behind the scenes on a lot of these issues with key players in Congress and the administration, educating them, telling them how detrimental the impacts of these tariffs would be. I think we could see a shift in tone if and when these tariffs do go into place. At that point, I think we start to see major trade, maybe not CEOs directly, but major trade associations work with staff on the staff level or with the member level in Congress on how to mitigate the risk here. And then, Rod, really quick, back to your last question, which I thought was a really good one. I do wonder are these going to be Pyrrhic victories for the Trump administration here? He goes in, proposes a tariff, gets a concession, and then declares victory. How long will that work before our allies do seek to diversify away from us? I just wonder. I think it's a valid concern. You obviously can't ignore the U.S. market completely, but I do think it is a danger that we are doing a hard reset on things that will really hurt America in the long run.
All right, so we're getting close to the finishing time, and there's one broad question I would love each of you to think about, and this is really hopefully tease you up to help everyone on this call in some form or fashion, and that is, what are you advising people do at this point in time in your market with your interests, with your government? I mean, all of us float between, I'll at least speak for myself. Yes, we do work with clients, but we're also advising policymakers, sometimes on behalf of clients. Sometimes it's just stepping back and they're saying, what do you think we do? How do we react to this? And so one of the things I think is really wonderful about the interrelationship, particularly our three firms have with so much, and particularly in this case, in the last 2 months, daily contact about here's what we're doing, this is what we're doing. And that is really shaping what we advise our clients to have nuance and substance. I'm curious what it is you're advising your clients to do. We talked about this last night, so I might come to you first if you don't mind, because you had more warning than others on that. But yeah, what is Earnscliffe doing?
Well, I go back to when NAFTA was reviewed a few years ago, and I don't know if it's a Canadian cultural politeness thing, or it's just like a lot of reliance on the politicos to do the negotiating, and it wasn't going so well. And then when industry started coming to DC and meeting with the representatives, meeting with industry partners from industry associations in the US, et cetera, things started to improve and concessions were being made. And I think that has also been apparent, albeit it's been a really uncertain terrain. But my advice is get your butt to DC. There's so many new representatives here. There's a lot in terms of our collaboration together, but it's not just meeting with the elected officials, it's really finding those allyships with US business. But it's not just DC. Canada has been very focused in doing concentrated damage to those Republican states where they are, and it's very sad to say, but pinpointing really key sectors where there's 2,000 jobs, there's this. I think those are the sort of touch points that need to start to build that sort of surround sound. Look, we all know President Trump's going to do what President Trump wants to do. But if I just don't think there's a strong enough understanding among the electorate in the United States on the intricacies of our economic relationship and the damage it could cause. And so my view is Canada industry, you can't just rely on the politicos. Start building those relationships, and we're here to support you in doing that.
Great advice. On
Quoting the expert, I would say, bring your butt to Washington, Mexico, and bring your butt to Ottawa, and bring evidence. We're coming out of an electoral cycle. Usually, electoral politics are very superficial. They are very policy free. They're very big perspective. This is a whole debate that it's putting the richest region in the planet in risk, and it's an evidence-free debate. So we need the private sector of the three countries getting together, bringing some clear evidence of which are the potential consequences of if this really happens, if this is not just a fashion. And that implies increased communication. One of the big questions in all of this is, who does the President Trump listen? And I think I have the hypothesis that it would be someone from the private sector. It won't be someone from the Republican Party that easily. It won't be someone from his own government. But the key sectors that will feel the pain, there should be kind of the speakers of bringing some evidence to the conversation. So I think that the three nations and the three private sectors have the huge responsibility to bring some data to the table and face the consequences. Because if you add up Canada and Mexico, it's more than 30% of US total exports. That's a lot of regions, that's a lot of communities, that's a lot of jobs, that's a lot of members of Congress which will be directly affected in their constituencies if Mexico and Canada decide to take a common policy to defend from this. And nothing of that has been come up in the conversation. It's just a single narrative from a single man, and it's such it requires a degree of complexity, much more broad, with different voices, just presenting effects of second and third order of a decision as it's presented.
Alan, your take on that?
Exactly right. The business community is going to have to drive the conversation on this. And you look at, I think Mary Ann made a good point. When you look at really the committees of jurisdiction here on the Ways and Means Committee, 75% of the Republican members there are new since Trump won. On the Finance Committee, I think it's about 50%. And these are, you think about these new members, these are members that have grown up in this new Trump consensus here. They need to understand, they need to hear from us. They need to understand the impact that these trade policies are going to have. And really, you know, Rod, you and I were talking about this earlier, but taking an all of the above approach. If you are a U.S. multinational and you have a presence in China, or I mean in Canada or Mexico, you need to be going to your Canadian, Mexican colleagues as well and telling them to get, what I want to say, get your butts out there, you know, and be lobbying them as well. But it's going to really take an all of the above approach here. It will be nuanced. I think the messages will be different country to country, but it's going to be absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I do think the one place I'll opine in this conversation is, I think business to business, and I agree with what you said needs to happen in alliances. But actually, the negotiations and any of this, whether it's USMCA or tariff, is still going to be government principle to government principle. And if you haven't actually made sure both sides of the aisle, all three sides of the border, have actually heard and have you on the priority list, you're easy to fall off. And so there is groundwork to be done. But I do think there's a nexus there of, if you're an American company and you're worried about it, you need to be dealing with Mexico City. If you're an American company, you need to be dealing with Ottawa, or vice versa. So I wanted to make sure we actually close on time, because it's tough when people are scheduling an hour and people keep running. So we are exactly at an hour. If people have questions, obviously you can reach out to any of us. And most importantly, now you can go to bed, because I think it's 3:30 in the morning, Colin. So 4:30 in the morning. So sorry, but appreciate you staying up late. Everybody, thank you. Thank you for the experts around the table. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rod.